Salutations, you thirsty Starfield fans. It is Matty here today. We finally got ourselves a little something, just a little something to sip on as we wait for whatever next Starfield update we get, whether it be constellation questions on the questing system or a new trailer, a release date, whatever it may be. I know that the Starfield community is much like me, thirsty. You want a little bit something, and there's actually a full almost 3-hour interview that just went out with Todd Howard. I'll have it linked in the description down below because it actually gets very philosophical. They even talk about the meaning of life. It gets very deep. I've quite honestly never seen this side of Todd Howard, but of course they get into everything Bethesda, from the partnership with Xbox to Starfield, a couple of new details on that. We get into Elder Scrolls 6, Fallout's TV show, and even the Indiana Jones video games. And there are little nuggets on each of them that we're going to get into today. So it's a pretty exciting news update. Again, I will have that full interview linked down below if you want to listen to it. I would recommend you do so because, like, I don't know if there's ever been a whack Todd Howard interview, but I digress. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in. And with that, if you are new here, you're into Bethesda news of any kind, pretty much, in this video at least, consider subscribing. With that, let's begin with the one I know y'all are curious about, Starfield. So we've been looking for some new details on Starfield, and what we have here are some more breakdowns of particular systems that we were already aware of when it came to the game. So for example, we knew that jumping from system to system was a thing in Starfield, but Todd Howard broke down how that's actually a level gated mechanic. What he defined it as, for example, is there's a level 40 system in the game. And so instead of what you saw with the rubber banding mechanic in Fallout, where maybe the glowing sea was higher level content where you're going to find legendary death claws out there, versus the northeast side, which is more mid-gamey and you're safe to go in there after you leveled up a bunch. This game breaks it up into systems. So certain systems will be much higher level than other systems out there. You feel? And he talked about how there are actually over 100 systems in the game. You can kind of collect those two ideas, put them together, and get a feel for how the level gating will work and how you can get this breadth of content in a unique way where it just feels like a very layered world as you go further and further beyond. He also confronted some of the skepticism in an inadvertent way by talking about how the planet number was generated. So one of the big concerns with Starfield right now is that 1,000+ planets, and how they went about making it was too much time and development devoted to it. Is the game going to feel more empty in comparison to all of these planets? And he really touched a lot on Daggerfall and how Daggerfall used a procedural generation system, as we all know, to populate its world, to populate its landscapes. And they sort of touched on that a bit as an inspiration for how they created the tool set to make the planets within Starfield, which he defined as tile sets that would effectively generate a whole planet, to put it simply. And he said that now it's effectively just changing a number, but they wanted to keep it a finite number so that they could manage it. And yes, as I've said before, there are going to be many planets that are just dedicated to crafting, settlement building, that type of stuff. But he also got into the idea of planets hosting their own buffs and debuffs, if you will, and how certain spacesuits you wear will impact those, which was a brand new detail. So the way he described it is that there are spacesuits that will have different buffs to fight off the various gases and toxicity of certain planets. I think you can look to something like, maybe I would say, No Man's Sky, where different planets behave in different ways, which would make sense, right? But also, you could look at even the HUD over on Starfield and see, like, there was a CO2, an oxygen, a gravity meter. So I imagine certain planets you'll be able to jump higher than others, and those little wrinkles will give them all a different look and feel. The reason I also mentioned look is because he mentioned they have their own day-night cycles, their own look and appearance. So there is more that goes into it that the player probably won't notice, but is there. The way he described it, though, is it's a system with a number, and if they wanted to make it another 1,000, they just click a number, and that's really it, because the tool set has been built, and that tool set was built off of pre-existing knowledge of something they used dating back to really the inception of the company when you think about it. So I am starting to shrug off some of that concern when it comes to Starfield and its planet count. I still do worry that it could have that as wide as ocean and deep as a puddle feel to it, but when you start to mention how it's a press of a button on a computer after the system is made, and that a lot of that time has been spent on handcrafted content, some of that worry fades and you just have to accept what it's going to be, which is a lot of planets are going to be empty and most likely spaces for modders to work. And speaking of modding, one thing Todd did touch on in this interview was that modding is something that they heavily consider from the get-go now, since their games have become heavily modded. And you could look at 76 and raise an eyebrow and say, well, that game still doesn't really have official modding like it was promised years ago, by the way. No one talks about that anymore, but it's something I personally remember because I think it would actually save that game, and there's a reason why 76 isn't as popular. Like, you could just have co-op Fallout with your friends and mod the heck out of it, but they're really not going there with it. But Starfield was built with modding in mind from the beginning, and I think this system is a part of that. How it affects the actual base vanilla product when we all sit down to play it, review it, and so on, I do not know, but worth considering 100%. What was also kind of neat to hear him say is that they are looking to do a survival or hardcore mode potentially down the stretch. They were talking again about that fuel system that we went into a bit with Starfield and how originally they had that and the player would get stuck in outer space, and they went, well, the fun kind of ends here. We don't want that. But he mentioned how this may be something that they get into down the stretch. And I think that would be cool because it's something that sounds like it already existed. They stripped out the feature, they replaced it with something else. So it may effectively be something they just end up plugging into the game later down the line and saying, here's your free survival mode or hardcore update. And I just hope they go a bit more in depth than they did with Fallout 4's. Fallout 4's survival mode I felt was pretty weak. They just ramped up the sponginess of enemies. They took away fast travel, and that was mostly it in the terms of substantial changes. I feel like here with Starfield, given its vast amount of mechanics, they could go further with it. Specifically, that fuel system would be a welcome addition to such a mode, but I digress. It's something that is on the table for them, and they are considering post-launch. Todd was also asked about the robots in Starfield, so they got into Vasco a little bit. Not who Vasco is or what it is, but he talked a bit about the presence of robotics in Starfield, and this was an interesting revelation because I know a lot of us are curious about alien life forms, robotics, AI, and how prevalent they are in Starfield. And I was pretty stunned to realize that Todd had said they dialed back a lot of the robots in this, and they've made mostly human worlds here. The reason I'm stunned by this is because I do look at something like Mass Effect Andromeda, which when you went from Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3, which had their own sets of solar systems, and how they created this, I would use the term galactic feel to it throughout its various races, and then you went to Andromeda and it was mostly the same. It felt like it wasn't a separate galaxy. So I'm curious how they're going to separate Starfield from the pack when it's mostly humans, is how he described it. This does seem to inch us towards, again, mostly humans, and away from what we were thinking would be alien races you speak to, and may start to line up with the speculation I've seen the Starfield community come up with, which is that pretty much a lot of the aliens you're going to encounter are going to be the creatures that you're fighting. And maybe that wasn't the right term to use off the get-go. I will say that would be severely disappointing if like the only alien race that is out there is like the one a part of the main story. I was hoping when they're going to all these different planets, you're going to see all different types of alien races. But when you look at the gameplay trailer closely, we still have yet to spot any of that. And it could be because of specific things they're showing us, but I will just say no aliens that you could talk to would be supremely disappointing, because I want that, I'll be honest, I'm going to use it, that term, that Star Wars feel. I want that Star Wars feel here in Starfield, and I already know if they don't do it, mod number one. Mod number one after the unofficial bug patch will be 100% aliens in Starfield. I already know that's where people are going to go. Just replacing NPCs with aliens. Last thing on Starfield was they got into some of the contact that you'll make out in these solar systems, and what we saw, of course, was a lot of space combat within the latest Starfield gameplay drop, but what Todd Howard revealed is that freighters will actually contact you. It's, of course, as we expected, not always going to be combat, but this is something that can happen while we're out there. So just some nuggets there for you to think on a little bit. They did get into a lot of other things like Elder Scrolls 6. So let's dive in a bit on that one. Now, Todd was asked, you know, what's the release date? When's this thing coming out? And he, of course, never said, but he did say he has a vague idea of it. And as he answered other questions, he got into the notion, as of course we expected, but just again, it helps when it's coming from the horse's mouth here. He did say it's going to be a long while, and he wishes that it was quicker. But this is what I mean by seeing a side of Todd that you typically don't see. Is he expressed some regret on how the situation was handled, saying if he could go back in time and do things a little differently, he wouldn't have wanted to make Elder Scrolls fans wait as long as they have between Elder Scrolls V Skyrim and Elder Scrolls 6. However, because of the support for Skyrim, because of people continuing to buy it, whether we joke about them reselling it over and over and over again or not, people are buying it, people are supporting it. The modding community is huge. It's still one of their most played games, if not the most played game. Todd said because of that long-term support, it changes how you look at the next thing in the series. So the idea is that they're making a game that they think about, how can we have Elder Scrolls 6 last 2 decades? How can it be relevant for 2 decades? And that is crazy to think about, because by the time Elder Scrolls 7 were to roll around, if they continue on this cadence, Todd will be a grandfather at that point. And then where is Elder Scrolls 8 coming from is the big question here. So there is this existential crisis within the thought process of any future BGS game. You know, Fallout fans, I know you're right there with me. We're like, what about 5 though? What about Fallout 5? They never really get into that, but Elder Scrolls 6 is a ways off, and they're thinking about it differently. And they've actually had an idea, Todd said, for the story and how it's going to begin for a long while now, he said. I found this particularly enlightening because it means that it likely is based in something pre-existing that has been around for quite a while. And I'd like to point your attention to a video I made many years ago, back when Skyrim Special Edition, yes, the first ever one back in 2016, had dropped. I remember I got a lot of blowback for this video, but it's starting to feel mighty promising. There is a book in this game that you can go read called The Great War. You pick it up and it talks about how there is a growing dispute between Hammerfell, the Red Guards, and the Thalmor, and how it's all going to take place in Hammerfell, where they fight on alone. And with this war brewing because of the White Gold Concordat, to me, it just screams that this would be the plot element that Todd is talking about, because what he does say in this interview is that they've known for a while that the beginning of the game is pretty set in stone. And to me, that would suggest that they have planted a breadcrumb somewhere where they know what they're going to pick up, and how they're going to handle it is really up to them. But I think the what is already in Skyrim. Again, I recommend that you go out and read that book, The Great War. I am not a Elder Scrolls lore nerd quite like I may be with Fallout, but I will say that this is a worthwhile read because I think it does have future implications. When you combine that with obvious teases that Bethesda has done officially, may I add, such as this one here that talks about the past, present, and future of the Elder Scrolls, and you see that the map is pointing to Hammerfell, every single sign that could possibly be official has indicated, even the trailer itself, based off breakdowns online, that the next Elder Scrolls game will be set in Hammerfell. And when Todd says, hey, we know how it's going to begin, I again want to point you to this book called The Great War in Skyrim. Pick it up, read it, takes a couple of minutes, and you might have a better idea of how Elder Scrolls 6 will go. They also got into Xbox, because of course, this is a significant deal. Just because we have the Activision thing going on, we can't ignore that there was a substantial acquisition with ZeniMax as a whole. And so one of the claims Todd made was that the culture that players see from the outside, as in, you know, being very forward-facing with supporting games, wanting the best for developers, trying to invest in new ideas. He claims that that culture for Xbox that people see is the culture inside. He's like, of course, you know, people are going to say, I'm going to say that, but the reality is that it is that good. And he talked very highly of that partnership, but he also did get into some of the pressures with it, because when they do release a game, he says, you know, typically it's not going to be a platform seller, but in this case with Starfield, it is different. We are trying to move platforms with it, and because of that, there is an added pressure to it. And it's something I never really thought of, because I think in a way, and Todd would probably know this better than anyone, but people do buy platforms for BGS games. I mean, one of my first 360 games was Mass Effect, World at War, Oblivion. And like, it was there in the beginning when I got it in 2008, I believe it was. So I was pretty late to the party, but Point being is those are platform moving games. Those are the games that encourage you to get over the hump. So to me, I feel like this just goes hand in hand. But of course, now knowing the pressure is, hey, we're a couple years into the generation and you're going to really be the main one to kick it off. You're going to have your Redfall, which I do not want to downplay. You're going to have your Forza, which I do not want to downplay. But the reality is Starfield is a level above in the terms of hype. And because of that hype, there is pressure internally to nail it. And he's talking about how they're really starting to feel that a bit, which I believe suggests they're coming down to the wire a bit here. They talked about the Fallout TV show, which was interesting to hear because it was mostly about the experience of making a game versus making a show. But when he talked about the actual show itself, one thing that Todd said was that they're not looking to retell a game story. So you're not going to see Fallout 3 or Fallout 4, which was one of my bits of speculation based off some of the casting decisions. I thought, well, this is reminding me a bit of Fallout 4. He confirms that is not going to be the case here. He talks about how they pick an area on the map and they just want to tell a story that fits in the world of Fallout, and it actually may even reference the games and add to them, if anything. So the idea is to build its own standalone thing, which I think is the best possible idea for a Fallout TV show. I am very interested based off the prop design. It looks quite faithful. I'm staying open-minded to it. I'm looking forward to covering it here on the channel because it will certainly be very different from anything we've done before. But for me, I just couldn't help but feel a little bit better hearing that, okay, like we're not messing with the games. We're not trying to retell Fallout 3, but we're going to have nods to it. Provided that's true, I think we can accept whether it's great or bad. It just won't interfere with the games. And if anything, help them. And of course, he did mention how we're going to try to make these shows accessible where if you haven't played the games, you can still enjoy Fallout, which I do think is very important. Last thing they talked about was Indiana Jones. Of course, we know that Machine Games is working on an Indiana Jones title, Todd Howard executive producing it, and this is something that he pitched to Lucasfilms over a decade ago. They decided they wanted to publish it, but Bethesda wanted to publish it, so that never happened. What happened 10 years later is now we have this partnership with Lucasfilm, Bethesda, Machine Games, and they are making an Indiana Jones game. Now, Todd defined that the team that's working on it now is a perfect fit because of the style of game they've made in the past versus the original team that he had in mind for Indiana Jones. I think this is really important to point out. And the reason I say that is because Machine Games, who has only made first-person games, is working on this. And I feel like that would suggest that it's going to have a lot of first-person elements since they are the perfect developer for it. However, when Todd is asked about the game, he was surprisingly composed and held back, but you could see the smile building on his face as he got into it. He called it a mashup of sorts and said it was intentionally done that way, which makes me think a bit of Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb. I played that on the original Xbox when I was a kid, and I loved that game. It's also, I believe, on Game Pass, I'm pretty sure, but if it's not, just go out and play, because this game rocks in my opinion. But it had third-person brawling, it had shooting missions, like it had a lot of things going on, which I think was very Indiana Jones. And to see what he's describing with this game, I imagine it'll be that feel where maybe it's first-person shooting, but also third-person brawling, and there's probably a lot of big set pieces. They're kind of subtly defining it as what sounds like an action-adventure game to me, but of course we can only guess. Still, those are the two little tidbits on that. Last thing, Todd Howard's career. He said he wants to do this as long as he possibly can. I mean, this is where it got really deep, and like Todd Howard even started to quote Confucius, and he dropped like a quote that took me for a loop where he said, there are two lives and one begins when you realize you only have one. And I was just like, whoa, that's heavy. But I digress. For those who are concerned about Todd working on games, it seems like he wants to do this as long as he possibly can. But that's everything that we got from this brand new interview. Again, that'll be linked in the description down below if you do want to check it out yourself. I thought it was a great listen, but I wanted to make sure I relayed to all of you who don't have almost 3 hours to listen to the podcast everything that came out of it that I thought would be relevant to you. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, take excellent care of yourselves. Let me know what you think of all these tidbits spread across pretty much everything Todd is working on in the comments down below. Other than that, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. Those links are in the description down below. And a big thank you to all the patrons, all the members who continue to support the hell out of the content here. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.